Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts, the American Logistics Aid Network, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, Big City Emergency Managers, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the National Emergency Management Association, the National Governors Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. Thank you for joining us. In today's discussions, our panel will address the near constant stream of supply chain disruptions in recent months, affecting everything from medical equipment and PPE to the upcoming holiday season. Today, our panel will discuss implications for Homeland Security and emergency management and what we can do right now in our own communities to avoid crisis. At the end of today's program, we will also provide information on a CHDS self-study course on supply chain resilience, which was authored by one of our panelists today, Phil Palin. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar discussion. David Kaufman is a frequent lecturer and instructor at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. He currently serves as the Vice President and Director for Safety and Security at CNA, a nonprofit organization providing in-depth research, analysis, and solutions to government leaders, and is also a leader in developing strategies to advance supply chain resilience. At CNA, Dave is responsible for executive management, development, and CNA's work in the areas of public safety, homeland security, emergency management, and public health. From 2009 to 2015, Dave served as the Associate Administrator for Policy, Program Analysis, and International Affairs at FEMA. And during his time there, Dave developed the agency's whole community approach to emergency management and its supporting doctrine, and also launched FEMA's Strategic Foresight Initiative. Dave, thank you for leading today's supply chain discussions, and now I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Dawn, and welcome everyone. Please allow me to introduce today's panel, and then we'll get started. Jim Featherstone is a frequent lecturer and instructor at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. Jim has served as the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Homeland Security Advisory Council, a position he assumed in March 2016 after nearly 30 years serving the city of Los Angeles. Throughout his career, Jim has been a respected voice in national homeland security and emergency management policy, serving as the chair of FEMA's National Advisory Council from 2008 to 2018. Kathy Fulton is the executive director for the American Logistics Aid Network. In this role, she leads the organization in delivering logistics information, services, and equipment to ensure communities have continuity of nourishment, hydration, and medical care during crisis. Kathy works tirelessly to leverage the unique skills of supply chain professionals to enable responsible disaster relief and build cross-sector collaborative relationships that support community resilience. Phil Palin is an experienced supply chain resilience subject matter expert who has worked with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and FEMA. Phil works with federal, state, local, and private sector leaders to prepare for and respond to complex, wide area catastrophic events involving dense populations. In 2020, he was involved in pandemic response and preparedness, especially focused on flows of food and medical goods. And he is a nationally renowned expert on getting supplies to survivors of catastrophes. So, welcome to our panelists. Welcome again to everyone else, and let's get started. Kathy, first question is to you. The past 18 months have seen a near constant stream of supply chain disruptions affecting everything from medical equipment and PPE to toilet paper, canned soup, seasonal products. How did the current congestion of the supply chain originate, and why, after 18 plus months, do these issues continue to persist?
All right, thanks, Dave. So I'm very hopeful that Jim and Phil will help fill in the gaps for this conversation because there's no single answer. I'll preface everything just by saying supply chains are complex. Not that they can't be understood, but they're not finite, right? They're not fixed and static. But modern supply chains are organized to fill demand. right? So they are constantly seeking sources of that demand. So while there's no one single explanation of exactly what has caused all of the challenges over the last 18 months, we can look at some things that are contributing factors. Extreme demand, right? And some of that is partially due to spending in places where we didn't normally spend, right? So we were staying at home, so we were spending more at the grocery store rather than restaurants. We were staying at home, so we were spending more on remodeling our homes, guilty, rather than traveling via air. So that's one factor on the demand side. On the supply side, we also have challenges where we had factory shutdowns overseas. We had labor shortages. We had for 20 years, various organizations have been talking about the truck driver shortages that are persistent in this country. So all of that, when you look at increased supply or increased demand, decreased supply, somewhere something has to give, right? I have a friend who likes to describe this kind of distortion as looking at like a balloon, and the pressure is moving around constantly, and the challenges are moving around constantly. Unfortunately, we haven't burst the balloon, right? But we are seeing that pressure building in various places, whether it's the ports, which is probably the most obvious one, or warehouses, which don't get talked about as much, but are just as much a contributing factor. You also asked about whether government interventions have contributed. And the answer is yes, and so those government interventions, some of them in direct response to the pandemic, did cause challenges to the supply chain, but that's not necessarily because of the actions themselves, but because of the nature of supply chains. They're complex and they're interdependent, and so any change, any thread that gets pulled in one location is going to cause disruption and dislocation in another location. I'm going to pause there because I see Phil and Jim look like they want to jump in.
I agree with everything Kathy says. I think, from the crisis manager's perspective, I don't know that we have educated ourselves or trained ourselves enough to identify the tripwires. I mean, this was definitely, and I'm sure Phil will say much more eloquently, but this was definitely a predictable surprise. I don't know.
It was predicted, Jim, but movies have been made about it.
I was speaking with a colleague actually earlier today that said, she said, how does she, as an emergency manager, how do I read the flashing yellow lights before they're flashing red lights? And I think that there were flashing yellow lights a long time before the current catastrophe. In fact, it because of the media, it's only been a problem, but, like going way back to work in 2015 with Phil, and certainly in more recent times with you, Kathy, that the tells have always been there. I don't know that we either didn't know how to read the tells or chose not to because there were other as we thought, more urgent issues. But not making a decision or not acknowledging something actually is a decision and is acknowledging something.
The only thing that I would add, I think Kathy has given the core analysis, but the add is all of the friction points and potential impediments that Kathy outlined have tended to be amplified by, in my notion, an over-concentration of sources and an over-concentration sometimes in flow. And so the most dramatic example of that for probably our audience is the vast majority, over 80% of PPE was being manufactured in China early in the pandemic. Golly, that's a long ways away. And it was typically, because it was a very low margin product, it was typically put on some of the slowest boats that would move from East Asia into, in my judgment, the overly concentrated ports of LA, Long Beach. I know you have to violently disagree with that, Jim, but 40% of imports coming into any place that proximate strikes me as a risk pool that I would not want to invest more in. But you see the same thing in meat processing. You see the same thing in fuel transportation. There, in our pursuit of efficiency, we have tended to achieve efficiency through concentration, and that has concentrated our risk as well.
Yeah. Phil, just to add on to that, the things that make us more efficient, make our supply chains more efficient and honestly less expensive, cheaper, also come with some inherent fragility, right? Because of that concentration. It helps keep costs down when you can concentrate things in a single location. But when something happens, and you have that much, like you said, 40% of imports coming in through basically one area of the country, it does cause, I don't want to use the term catastrophic, it causes big effects. How's that?
So, well, I mean, it's been said, COVID didn't create dysfunction as much as it revealed dysfunction.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So thank you, all three of you, for that. So demand, recognizing tells, being aware of what those tells are, cognizance of knock-on effects, unintended consequences from our actions, as well as the points we've just been emphasizing around concentration or over-concentration and friction in the systems. Lots to unpack there as we go forward. So Jim, I want to turn to you. You're an experienced practitioner. Are the disruptions that we're talking about and that we're experiencing right now, you can't turn on a news broadcast or open a paper without seeing this splashed across the top right now. Are these just, inconveniences affecting Americans' daily lives, or are there meaningful implications for Homeland Security and emergency management as well? And if so, what are those?
Well, it's real easy to inconvenience Americans. But are we at a point of criticality in terms of supplies? I would defer that to Phil and Kathy. But the inconvenience, I think a lot of the inconvenience, the quote unquote inconvenience we're experiencing right now, it goes back to Kathy's issue of demand. So has the demand increased, or the type of demands, have they increased? I mean, the fact that we won't offload enough transformers for the Christmas, I don't know, do they still use transformers? I don't know, too old. But will we offload those? Is that an inconvenience, or is it a problem? The fact that we will actually start to see impacts in the food and pharma supply chains, that's more than an inconvenience. That adds a level of criticality to the supply chain challenge, which has been around. It didn't happen in the last 10, 20, 30 days. I mean, this has been around for a while, and it's been exacerbated because of, I think, the attention that's been given to it and some very visible choke points. I mean, the coast off the coast, the waters off the coast of LA Long Beach port, or the trains backed up in Chicago. That's very real, and so that translates to, when again I ask the question: is it inconvenience, or are we at a point of criticality?
Except in some very, very rare cases that can be handled with air freight. We're not talking about a life safety issue here. In my definition, we're not talking about criticality. We're talking about a matter usually of convenience. Volume, that Port of LA, Long Beach that I've just been criticizing has also, because of its efficiencies that we haven't heard much about, but because of its efficiencies, it is actually, its throughput volume is about 26% better than last year, this year. It's just that our demand that Kathy's talking about is maybe 35% more than 25%. But the flow, the volume is enormous. It's significant. Velocity has been troubled because demand is so high that we're not as efficient and effective at targeting the flows as we used to be.
So Phil, he's had me thinking, recently in the big three, demand, I think it's demand, supply, and flow. So how does the local crisis manager get a sense of those big three, because they're almost like sides of a triangle? The triple constraints. If you move or stretch one, the other two are affected by it.
The local emergency manager, the governor's staff, FEMA staff, White House staff pays attention to those three, develop relationships around the key participants in all three of those, reaches out to those participants when they need more than a generalist understanding. I think the most dramatic example from a local emergency management perspective has been the discovery that one of the contributing factors to the volume moving through the port of Long Beach being a little bit lower than it might otherwise be, it's still way above prior levels, but it could be even higher, except for a local Long Beach ordinance that restricted stacking of containers to 2 high instead of usually at most global ports that's 6 high. Once the private sector pointed that out, within about, I think it was even 48 hours, Long Beach had taken care of that, and they're now stacking it. There's a temporary waiver. No one wants to lose their ocean views, but there's a temporary waiver that now allows the containers to be stacked double high, up to 4. And that really, in the last 2 to 3 weeks, that has contributed to the reduction in dock density that had really been screwing up a throughput. And I will say it was actually getting to the point that it might have constrained volume. So they've opened it up, a lot more movement, a lot more extraction. And one of the secrets there, only one, but one of the secrets was a local zoning ordinance.
Highlighting the point, Kathy, that you made earlier about sort of the knock-on effects and the unintended consequences that can manifest in a complex system from actions which may have been taken some time ago or for totally unrelated reasons.
In my experience, Dave, especially in a catastrophe, there are so many of these kind of constraining factors that it's critically important that local and all the way up to national decision makers have the pre-existing understanding to be able to do a scan to decide where they're going to invest, where it's going to have the biggest outcome, the biggest benefit to the whole system. They're not going to have a trouble finding a way to spend their time. They're going to, the challenge is choosing to spend their time and resources where it will matter most.
So let me probe you further on that, Phil. You've been advising emergency management officials at all these levels for some time. In your experience, what are the top things that we need to better understand about the systems, about the flows, if we're going to recognize those intervention opportunities, if we're going to effectively advance supply chain resilience?
Generalists, policymakers, strategists need to focus exactly where Jim has been focusing. And frankly, where Kathy said it matters most, and that is understand demand. 10 years ago, a lot of emergency managers had never heard about food deserts. I hope they know about vaccine deserts. And I hope they have learned to apply some of the lessons that they should have learned about food deserts and the socio-technical solutions to food deserts that also apply to many vaccine deserts. So pay attention to understanding your sources, your places, your timing of demand. Boy, if you can get access to some key elements of SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program data, get that. That's going to help you see the food picture in your jurisdiction really, really clearly. Understand where your sources of supply are. Where does the food that the SNAP recipients pay for with their EB2 card come from? In LA, it's often pretty close. There's a lot of food processing around LA. Same thing in Portland, same thing in Seattle. Boy, you get out to Washington, D.C., and they depend a whole lot on Eastern Pennsylvania and upstate New York on food processing. Everyone depends on the port of LA Long Beach and the Great Valley of California for their fresh foods. But understand where those foods are coming from. Years ago, I talked to the local emergency manager. He assumed that in the case of a catastrophic event, that since the next county over had a Walmart distribution center, that he was sitting pretty. He didn't need to be concerned. I'm not sure that assumption was a well-founded assumption. And partly that's because of how quickly the Walmart distribution center turns, maybe especially in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophe. And then it is that relationship, that flow, that freight movement. Early in the pandemic, Pennsylvania will never lose the blame for shutting down the interstate rest stops early in the pandemic. Talk about something that could have fragmented flow, slowed down flow, really done a job on supply chains. That decision by that well-intended, sort of entirely reasonable decision, if you know nothing about supply chains or freight movement, really was a danger. And this is why this understanding, just generalist understanding, to think of the flows that move supplies toward demand and what we can do to not get in the way and to facilitate when we can. Is that answering, Dave?
So I hear you going much deeper than just understanding the grocery stores that are in my community. Right, you're talking about understanding where the product comes from that shows up on those shelves, how it's moved. It almost becomes overwhelming. Like follow-up question to all of you. Where do we begin in trying to assemble that picture?
I'm not communicating very well if I've made it sound like you need to know that much. I'm really suggesting I do think, especially in catastrophe preparedness, that water, food, fuel, and freight are especially important. When you've got a really bad deal, a long-lasting deal, you want to know that water, food, fuel, and freight are moving. No, you don't need to know. You shouldn't try. If you're a local emergency manager or you're the governor's chief of staff, please don't try. Instead, learn just enough about demand, supply, and flow that you can conceive a strategic picture. You can ask good questions, and you can understand good answers, and then develop the relationships with people that already know and will be your critical partners in the midst of a catastrophe.
Yeah, Dave, as Phil was talking, one of the things I wrote down was, demand and economic drivers. But as I was listening to him talk, it made me think it's beyond that. So yes, it is important to understand the economic drivers of your community, because that is, that's what's helping to feed and fuel and all of those things for your community. But Jim, maybe this is where I mentioned the National Academy's report and understanding that fueling or supplying communities post-crisis really has to do with those pre-existing supply chains. So it's an understanding of what is there. Not, again, so supply chains are complex. It's not that they can't be understood, but you have to understand that any picture you get is only a point in time, right? So when you think of it in terms of what are the pre-existing activities, you also have to take into account, food banks. Phil, you mentioned SNAP, and that one's huge, right? So it's that holistic picture, not necessarily going deep, but going broad enough so that food, fuel, freight, and I don't know what the fourth one you said was. Yeah, water. Yeah.
So maybe the picture I have in mind is the difference between a lieutenant or a sergeant that has been assigned to take that hill 100 yards away and needs to work through all the detail of crossfire and muck and mud and that river crossing and everything else in between. There are supply chain professionals that will do that. The general needs to be up on the hill where he or she can see the whole watershed and understand where if I see flow coming from over there and I need flow to go over there and it's been diverted, what are my options? Which sergeants, which lieutenants do I need to engage to be sure that that flow that is now needed over there is moving in that direction with the greatest velocity, both speed and targeting as possible?
I think that's a very important distinction. Thank you. So we opened this talking about the congestion in the supply chain that we're all living through right now. Over the course of these last few minutes, we've also introduced sort of what happens in acute moments of crisis as part of that as well. So keeping kind of both of those frames in mind, I'm curious to hear from each of you what keeps you up at night about this. What are the concerns from a supply chain standpoint that most occupy your minds, when you think about our business in Homeland Security and emergency management? Kathy, do you want to start?
I can start. So a couple of conversations recently have led me really to think that the politicization of supply chain as a topic has potential to cause more disruption than to increase flow. And I'll talk about it from a couple of different contexts, because I think from an international, it's a whole lot easier to understand how that, can have an impact, right? We have tariffs that, 2.5, 3 years ago, that was the number one thing we were worried about was the tariffs, right? But also export restrictions. Speaking with a partner who lives in a country to the north of us, and he said, the U.S. restricted exports of PPE. At what point are they going to restrict exports of food? And what's that going to do to us who are so reliant upon food production in the U.S.? But I also think that when we look at it from a domestic perspective, and we talk about supply chains all the time now. It's in the news constantly. I think that there's a bias towards doing something. And as I led off by saying, sometimes when you do something, it pushes the pressure to somewhere else. And perhaps it may cause more harm. And to Phil's point, you have to be strategic and understand where those interventions are going to be useful.
Jim?
Yeah, I'll answer the question, but I think maybe, and certainly not to speak for, I think Kathy was kind of alluding to one of the big recommendations in the National Academy's report about the existing organic supply chains and how in a crisis situation, the crisis logisticians who do an amazing job, they, get stuff moving right away and they get moving as much as they can. And I don't know if enough strategic thought is given to resurrecting or bringing the left of bank supply chains back to vertical, because they are designed for that. We had a conversation a while ago. We were talking about pods, how you set up the amazing, beautiful state-of-the-art Western shelter structures in the parking lot of Safeway. Safeway, by its nature, is a pod. It's a commodities points of distribution. That's what it was designed to do. So why not get Safeway back up and running? What does Safeway, and I'm just using that generically for grocery stores, not plugging Safeway, but what do the grocery stores, which are functioning pods on any given day, what do we need to do to get them back up and running? So but going back to your question, Dave, so that just gets me energized. But I struggle.
Couple of years ago, within the last couple of years, Kathy and I have been on a teleconference with a fairly senior state official who runs their pod program, and we started the conversation. They outlined their need. They were looking for a few more million FEMA meals. We started the conversation by trying to confirm what we understood about their local grocery store situation. And you could tell it was only voice. It wasn't a Zoom. But while the state official was being polite, you could sort of say, who are these idiots asking me about grocery stores? What does that have anything to do with the fact that I have an 820,000 or something like that pull on FEMA meals, that I'm going to run out of FEMA meals? And of course, we were trying to make the point that you just made, Jim. Grocery stores are the biggest pre-planned pods that our society has developed. And one of the most important things that we can do as a society, public and private, is to facilitate continued flows to those giant pods. And then be sure that our smaller pods are being inserted exactly where they're needed, not just where people will take the free food if they can. So, that understanding that the fuel rack is the pre-existing fuel rack is the most effective way of distributing fuel post-bang, that the pre-existing grocery store and distribution center and the trucking in between is the most effective way to feed survivors post-bang. That is the strategic insight. I'll answer your question for me. Sorry. What keeps me up at night is a quick onset catastrophic event. And I mean something that takes down the grid for who knows, and takes down telecoms with it for who knows. And that is when you need to have the pre-existing understanding and the pre-existing relationships to decide how on earth are we going to move water, food, fuel, and freight when the grid is down and telecoms are down. that is when all of this relationship building and all of this understanding pays off biggest. It pays off in some other ways, but that's when it pays off biggest.
Which, and Phil's answer was actually my answer to your question, Dave, before I digressed, was that, you know, what keeps me awake at night is that the crisis management community may not have or may not be applying the sense of awareness that it needs to have on supply chain issues. So when this no notice event happens, that there's already a practiced scan of, you know, supply, demand, freight, you know, and the four sectors, specifically the four sectors that Phil talked about. It doesn't mean that it has to be actionable every day, but it's part of your, you know, like a pilot scans, you know, all the different gauges. It's not, he or she is not necessarily making adjustments, but that's just part of their awareness as they fly this plane along. And as crisis managers essentially fly their planes along, where is supply chain in their scan? And I don't know that we've routinized it enough yet so that we aren't caught completely flat-footed by the no-notice catastrophe.
And go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say, just very briefly to add on to that, we are still nascent in our understanding, right? We don't even have the right lingo yet. And so that makes it very difficult. You know, if we're very uncomfortable with a topic, it makes it really difficult whenever something occurs to jump right in. The more that we can do to familiarize ourselves with that lingo, with those topics, the better off we're going to be when the crisis does occur. Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Well, of course, now I've been stimulated by what you said and forgotten what Jim said. So where I will go with that is over the pandemic, there has been some very constructive private-public interactions that I think have improved incrementally some of that readiness. And I'm concerned that some of the lessons being learned for a slower onset catastrophe, and I think that's what we're still going through. Those lessons being learned for a slower onset catastrophe are not necessarily the same lessons that we need to learn for a quick onset catastrophe. We're always fighting the last war, and we've learned some very important lessons from the war we've been fighting since January 2020. But I'm concerned about New Madrid. I'm concerned about Cascadia. I'm concerned about a Cat 5 up the I-95 corridor in Florida, or taking out Tampa Bay, and all the implications for supply chain that would indicate for those millions of survivors. And so I don't want us, when we will have a day of victory over COVID, but I don't want us to assume that we have learned all the right lessons about supply chain resilience, even from learning the hard knocks lessons that we've learned in this event.
Yeah. So can you give an example or two, or you, Kathy, or Jim, of lessons that we've learned, as you said, for the slow developing catastrophe that might be misapplied in a rapid onset catastrophe?
Go ahead.
I'll throw the bomb as far as some folks that are probably on this call. I'll never be invited back again. And I would say it's a misunderstanding and a misapplication of the Defense Production Act in this event. And what that means for me is that there's all sorts of benefit for the public and private sector to get together behind closed doors and talk turkey with each other. You don't need to do that with a gun pointed at your head.
Yeah.
You don't need to do that with the government coming into the room with a solution to try to cram down your neck. I think it's Title VII of the DPA allows for conversations.
Voluntary agreements.
Voluntary agreements. Great. Title I and Title III, if I'm remembering my statute, I'm not convinced they're needed as often as there is some inclination to think they should be applied almost in every hard event where the private sector is involved. And what I'm also concerned about, maybe most concerned about, is that it gets in the way of developing those meaningful cross-sector relationships without DPA. It's like we've got to get to a certain threshold before DPA can be enforced, and then we can have a conversation. Don't wait for that. Don't wait for us to be past boom when DPA can be justified. Start with those conversations now, locally, regionally, nationally, globally.
Kathy, was there something that you wanted to get in on?
No, I mean, I think that, Phil, you stated that very well. I'm actually going to go with something a little more tactical in that I think some of the lessons that have been learned over the past 20 months are that local government entities have to do it themselves. That they have to have their own stocks of PPE or other things because no one else, no one else is doing it. And I think that from a competitive, I think the position that people got put in was this, I'm competing against the city across the way. I think it was a very negative thing rather than the ability to think collaboratively about a common enemy.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I think if I could frame the comments that you just made as pitfalls to avoid, and I'm curious to hear from each of you a little bit about, if we accept the premise of this conversation, what can we do about it? What are the pathways for action as practitioners in this space, regardless of where we sit? How do we work this problem? What strategies do we take? And are there other pitfalls we should avoid besides the predisposition to our own direct action? At least those of us in government, which is how I would characterize some of what I just heard from you and Kathy and Phil, is that we often exhibit a tendency to act directly against the problem that we've identified first. And you're suggesting that there might be other things we should be doing first. So how do we move the ball forward? What pathways for action are available to us? And what other pitfalls do we need to be mindful of? Jim.
Be humble and acknowledge that we don't know what we don't know. I've had the good fortune and the pleasure of being around Phil and Kathy and people like them a lot more than most folks, in my part of the business in the world. But I will never be a subject matter expert like them, but just the sense of awareness and the professional curiosity, humbling myself and opening myself up to this world, this fascinating world of supply chain resiliency, especially in the crisis arena, has given me an awareness, and the folks that I've worked with over the years, an awareness I don't think is pervasive enough on the crisis management side of the house. So, we don't know what we don't know, and that's okay. It's bad if we stay in that position, but we have an opportunity to get to where we know what we don't know. We have some sense of what we don't know, and you got to talk across the table with the people that do this for a living.
Yeah, I think the willingness to, Phil, I'm going to steal your line here, embrace the complexity that we're dealing with. Jim, it does go back to humility. And, I think as crisis managers, we are often put in the position of being the person who is in the know and the person who can do something. And we have to set that aside and say, the best thing that I can do is to ask more questions.
The good news is that after the last 20 months, there's a lot more sophistication about supply chains generally and supply chain resilience than there was. The caution about learning the right lessons nonetheless. I would say there are still a lot of people that have been curious, have been reading, but have not yet been doing. Mm-hmm. And for you, trying to look straight into the camera and talk to you. Whether you're local, whether you're regional, whether you're national, think about water, food, fuel, freight. Maybe one of those seems more interesting to you than others. If you're local or regional, figure out who are your biggest providers of food, fuel, and freight. In most jurisdictions, most places, even most regions, it's seldom going to be more than 3 to 7 grocery distributors or fuel providers. Call up one of them, ask to come over and get a tour of their refinery, of their fuel rack, of their grocery distribution center. Come, as Jim said, with humility. Come, as Kathy said, with questions, authentic questions, not leading questions, not questions that have an agenda behind them. Don't tell them much of anything about what you do unless they ask you questions. But ask them questions to establish an authentic relationship. It's a first date. It's a private-public first date. And just keep asking questions and show that you're interested and say that you want their phone number to be able to call them up after this first date. And that, Dave, I think would be a very practical first step. It can lead in all sorts of other directions, but that initial investment is very important.
That's great.
So it's just like the first hinge for private-public partnerships here, Phil.
Well, one of my other favorite phrases is we need to learn how to dance on the cusp of chaos.
Yeah.
And I think the public-private dance can be especially elaborate and sort of difficult. But boy, if we'll begin it with as much mutual respect and curiosity as we possibly can, that's going to be a much nicer dance than otherwise.
It's a nice image. This has been an excellent conversation so far. I know we have a number of questions that have come in from participants during the course of the conversation thus far. Dawn, do we have questions that you'd like to bring forward for our participants?
Yes, Dave, thanks. Several questions coming in, and thanks to the audience for those. A question for our entire panel. Has just-in-time manufacturing, lean practices, other business trends discouraged preparedness with our private sector partners? And if so, is there a role for government to incentivize preparedness, including supply chain resilience with our business partners? Throw that open to any of our panelists.
So I'll try. Because my friends who are experts in lean management tell me that preparedness is not mutually exclusive from good supply chain practices, but in fact they should go hand in hand, because lean is all about not having waste. the questioner also asked about incentivizing, and I think that there are opportunities there. I think that when it is done appropriately, certainly we don't want to be sitting on mountains of PPE like we've seen now, and hand sanitizer that has to be destroyed. But appropriate incentives where the stocks can be worked through appropriately, inventory management strategies can be managed appropriately. I think that there are opportunities there, but I don't want people to come away with the thought that that supply chain optimization is to blame for all of these challenges, because it's really not. It's just perfect storm, bad combination of factors.
I think Jim should have the last word on this, but I will add that I agree with Kathy. I don't know of any core best practice business strategy that should get in the way. Quite the opposite. But I do think there are public sector practices that get in the way. As a private sector guy until the last 10 years, and then trying to work this cross-cultural notion over the last 10 years, that the way that the two cultures, public and private, make decisions, and the time that is invested and the processes that are used are just dramatically different. And the typical, where a lot of this pre-catastrophe preparedness would happen is under a planning rubric that is, I'll just say, from a private sector perspective, is really tedious. I mean, it just really takes a lot of time. And it seems to expect that we're talking about things that can actually be predicted. And at least, especially in catastrophe, you can anticipate, but you can't predict. Why are you going that deep? And maybe that goes back to earlier, Dave, when you misunderstood me or I miscommunicated going deep. I wasn't talking going deep. I was talking about being strategic, because frankly, that's what private sector spends most of its time trying to do. Then it pays people to implement the strategy.
Kathy, a follow-up question for you on your earlier answer, specifically addressed to you in the Q&A. Any advice for non-governmental organizations, what NGOs might be doing to address their own supply chain issues, or at least contribute to resilience for the broader community?
Yeah, Dawn, thank you for that. And, we have the benefit of working with so many amazing nonprofit organizations who are the core of their community. And they have those same opportunities, right? They have the same needs. They are pre-existing supply chains, but they are also heavily dependent on those for-profit supply chains. We actually saw a good deal of disruption within the food banks early on in the pandemic because of more people eating at home rather than eating at restaurants, and donations that normally would have come from grocery stores because of potential spoilage were not coming that way. But it is incumbent upon NGOs, and many of them are doing this through VOADs and other structures, to get involved in the conversation, right? If they're part of the community, they also need to be included in the planning and preparation activities.
Jim, Phil, a question for both of you. Do any of the advice or recommendations that you've given today for emergency management leaders or the business sector, does any of that vary for geographically remote areas? Two questions. One mentioned particularly rural parts of the country, another mentioned the Hawaiian Islands and the Western Pacific. Any different advice for those folks?
I'm a big student of lessons learned. As Stanley McChrystal said, the tuition at the School of Experience is much too high to not learn from others. When we were in Puerto Rico, we asked if they were looking at other places that were geographically similar, like Hawaii or Alaska, and they said, no, that we're different. Yeah, we're different, but there's a lot of similarity there. And I think the more learning from Hawaii's not going to get a snowstorm, and Alaska's not necessarily going to get a hurricane, but the way that these jurisdictions manage supply chain issues before, during, and after their regular catastrophe, and I'm not trying to be funny, but the catastrophe or hazard or risk that they deal with all the time, learning from them, and then just, with a little tweaking, applying those lessons learned is very important. You're right. And I think in government, we try to think always one size fits all, but, the municipal, yes, there are a lot of similarities in terms of supply chain challenges for a big, complex municipal jurisdiction and for a geographically remote jurisdiction, but there are also the unique opportunities or unique occurrences that, to learn from. And I would say learn from a place that may not be exactly like yours, but may have similar challenges in terms of geography, threat, supply chain proximity, similar flow patterns, those kind of things.
More remote locations often have a trade-off between density and distance. The less dense your population, typically the more options you have in terms of both stockpiling and in terms of emergency insertion of sufficient supplies. But the distance factor amplifies the complications of doing both and the expense of doing both. And so Jim's right, look at lessons learned from other remote locations. It's in my judgment, it's hard in both dense urban and in distant rural settings, and the islands can just be mind-staggeringly difficult.
If I could just add just a quick addendum to what Phil and Jim both said, because in places like Hawaii or Alaska, or Puerto Rico for that matter, other places where you have such distance, the lead time for moving relief supplies, et cetera, from the mainland or from other places of supply at scale to those locations is not measured in hours. It's days or weeks. I think it places an even greater premium on some of the points that were made earlier in the conversation about understanding demand in our communities, understanding supply in our communities, understanding flow, and being able to anticipate which needs may be most critical in that acute moment and have some ability to sort of gut check that against, Jim, to your point, tells, to your word at the very beginning of the conversation, what are we seeing happening on the ground? Because the lead time to gap fill is so long that it really plays that up. And I think there are excellent insights and lessons from work all three of you have been involved in, looking back at Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico that really can highlight those examples. I know we're at the top of the hour here. I'd like to turn it back to our panelists for any closing thoughts they may have. And for one final question, what is one thing that everybody listening to today's webinar can take away from this conversation that they can do right now to move the ball forward in their own communities or in their own space? So one thing that they can take that's actionable to move on, as well as any final reflections on this afternoon's conversation. Jim, would you like to start?
Definitely reach out to the people that do this for a living. I mean, like I said, I'm a hack golfer, and the thing, when I get in a bind, I can always tell myself, be humble. Don't try to curve it around the tree. I'm not as good as Tiger Woods. Punch it back out into the fairway, be humble, and learn from my mistakes. But the conversation with the private sector is huge, because if nothing else, you don't necessarily have to know which levers to pull, but just knowing that figuratively these levers exist, helps you in terms of your overall understanding of the supply chain and its strengths and its fragilities.
Thank you. Kathy?
I like Jim's point about don't overcomplicate it, keep it simple. But I'll also add, find a good source of information, whether that's a person, whether that's, a favorite news source, and start learning the lingo. The more that you can do to prepare yourself from an education and knowledge standpoint now, the better off you're going to be when the better off you're going to be in applying that with your relationships that are important.
We're all three saying the same thing, just with different words. Get thee to thy freight dispatch center.
Yeah.
Get thee to thy fuel racks. Get thee to thy grocery docks and take your dancing shoes.
Excellent. So I've really been struck as we've gone through this discussion this afternoon, how much this comes back to really simple things. Know thyself, right? How strongly each of you emphasized the importance of understanding our own communities and how they work every day, albeit from a demand and supply standpoint, from a flow standpoint. But that's the same challenge that we face when we talk about understanding what the public's needs are going to be in a crisis. What's the public going to do, et cetera, et cetera. So know thyself. And then I love these points about being curious and being humble as we go forward. What I think is equally stark is what I have not heard, which is teach others our own language. Seek to indoctrinate them, seek to take control of their operations or anything of that ilk. So it's a really good reminder about our own mental frames and our approaches. So thank you all. Excellent conversations. Thank you to our participants. Great questions. Dawn, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you. On behalf of the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security and our co-host organizations, we thank our moderator, Dave Kaufman, and our panelists today, Jim Featherstone, Kathy Fulton, and Phil Palin, for providing such a great session. And as we close, we'd like to share more information about the recently released CHDS Supply Chain Resilience Self-Study course featuring today's panelist, Phil Palin. You can find more information on registering for that course in the Q&A box now, and also in our closing video. Thank you again for joining us today.